Tack ska du ha. Kan alla höra mig? Oh, can everyone listen to me? Hear me now. So my name is Maria Lindelén, and I work for IUCN. And I want to thank you all for being here today for this session, looking at how we're advancing on transboundary water cooperation. Is it fit for principle but insufficient for purpose? I want to thank the co-conveners of this session. So it's ICN, it's also the International Water Management Institute, the Oregon State University, and together with the Department of State, US Department of State. So we'll be looking a little bit at the trends of transboundary water cooperation, assessing the pace, and then we're going to have a very interesting panel debate. So I want to first welcome to the stage Julian Kachinoff, who's the water team lead at the US State Department, to just open this session for us. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is my first session. I landed just about an hour ago, which is a pro tip to get over jet lag is to go straight into a session on transboundary water cooperation. It works every time. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Maria, for inviting me to speak. Very excited to kick off the session. Very much looking forward to the insights, both in the room and also from our co-hosting organizations, IUCN, EME, and Oregon State. We've had very close and very productive partnerships with all of those organizations in a variety of geographies and themes over the years, including the most recent Shared Waters facility. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Julian Kachinoff. I'm the water team lead at the U.S. Department of State. Our team is tasked with managing the overlap between freshwater and U.S. foreign policy. For the United States, water is crucial both for human security, of course, but also U.S. national security. Our work, the work of our team, is shaped by the first ever White House action plan on global water security and through our implementation framework, which is titled the U.S. Global Water Strategy. The strategy itself places a priority on advancing water cooperation, and it seeks, where possible and appropriate, to reduce tensions over shared waters and prevent water insecurity from being a driver of state fragility. Clearly, we don't do this work alone. In addition to our embassies overseas, we work alongside a very broad interagency group of technical experts, including our colleagues at USAID, to drive a whole-of-government effort on water. I wanted to very quickly reflect on the theme of the session through that frame. Our team of water diplomats plays a fairly unique role in advancing water security through this approach, because as the title of this session suggests, to be fit for purpose in water diplomacy, you really have to be a jack of all trades, master of none. So to explain myself a bit further, our team is unique because we're not really water experts. Few of us, myself particularly, would ever consider ourselves technical leaders in hydrology or engineering or water quality. We're also not a development agency. Unlike our colleagues at USAID or Millennium Challenge Corporation, we don't oversee large development projects or foreign assistance programs. Equally, we're not a regulatory agency like our environmental protection agencies, so we don't have a daily experience of setting standards or enforcing standards through enforcement actions. We are also not a science agency like our colleagues at NASA or USGS, and we don't manage large infrastructure like our friends at the US Bureau of Reclamation or Army Corps of Engineers. So we're not a lot of things, but by being free from any specialization, our team, our water diplomats, are free to think outside of the box. We focus less on the technical challenges in front of us than on building effective processes for sound, inclusive decision-making that's driven by the best available science. As we'll hear today from the speakers and panelists, there's more than meets the eye in water cooperation. There's far more, of course, as we know, to effective water cooperation than an agreement on a page. There's far more to building a strong river basin organization than meeting reporting deadlines and hosting ministers. There's a lot more behind rule curves that dictate how large reservoirs will be operated. There's a lot more in how competing needs are managed, and far more in how countries finance infrastructure. These multi-layered and often quite political dynamics can complicate and frustrate effective cooperation. In the work that I know many of you do, it's a world of increasing change, and it's a world of increasing misinformation, of shifting expectations, both of institutions and of governments. And so water managers increasingly are finding themselves under growing pressure to deliver on their objectives while having to navigate issues that extend far beyond their capacities and mandates. In other words, they need help. So today's water manager must manage risk, public affairs, finance, diplomacy, politics, information, engineering, and science at a scale greater scale and intensity than ever before. So I would share with you this afternoon that our role is to sharpen our awareness of these evolving dynamics, to give ourselves the permission to step back from our regular toolkits or specializations, and to take in the broad picture, to try to question our assumptions, and to look at water cooperation challenges in a new light. We really do need to tailor our diplomatic toolkit and support to manage these challenges with an appreciation that these aren't explicitly in the standard job description. They're not in the standard work requirements or project scope. So will this require a refresh? I think so, which is why, as I said, I'm truly excited for this session, and I hope we can hear some of these new perspectives during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great opening to sort of set the scene a little bit and to continue with the framing of this session and give a little bit of a thought behind what the co-conveners of this session were thinking when we set it up. I'm inviting Jonathan Lautze, research group leader at IMI, to come and do a little framing. Oh, no. You're supposed to talk to this.
Okay, great.
And there's the thing for the PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks, Maria. And let me just echo what she said in terms of Julian's overview. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so that was great context already. I feel like my job is partly done. How do I? Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to give a bit more background, as Maria highlighted, just a bit of the context, what drove this session, where did it come from? It was interesting, even over lunch, we had a nice discussion around this title, which apparently Julian picked up. I think people are understanding, which is great. Basically, is the pace of cooperation fast enough, or is it effectively, our strategies, are they fit for principle but falling short a bit on purpose? So this session conceptualization really came out of a conversation between James Dalton from IUCN and myself, who are two of the three implementing agencies on this, along with Oregon State. And a lot of the thought was centered around, are we moving fast enough? You heard Maria just now talk about the pace of cooperation. So how do we know? What are the benchmarks? A real common one when it comes to measuring progress is this SDG 6.5 in terms of getting cooperation on all transboundary waters. And by reasonable estimates, we're not going to get there by 2030. So we're going to fall short. Other common metrics that people look at, like is water cooperation, or sorry, water conflict. And I noted, although I didn't fully attend it, in the session preceding this, I think there was just another report coming out showing water conflict is increasing. Again, you can question the methods on these things, but it seems like there's work to be done. Like maybe despite a lot of good progress, it may not be sufficient. As I said, 6.52 may not be achieved. Whether conflict is really subsiding, the jury's out. Probably there's a lack of definitive evidence on that. And then really another big one looming is this climate change. Are we ready? Are we ready to face the challenge of climate change in transboundary waters? I was participating in a session this morning. I think some of the people in the room were there. Clearly not in the Himalayas, unfortunately, at this point. So then that motivated the question, as Julian said, do we need a refresh? If so, if we're not proceeding fast enough, then what does need to change on the part of development financiers, on the part of governments, on the part of river basin organizations, on the part of others? What do we need to look at? So that's what this session is about, trying to find some new approaches or revisions to current approaches that can be pursued so that we do a better job at this. And we in our own head, I think in our own discussions preceding this, we had some key threads, I think, which are listed here in some of those sub-bullets, which do come up quite a bit around financing. And again, these are almost broken records, some of them. The need for sustainable financing, I think just in the preceding session that came up around monitoring, the need for longer term financing for monitoring. Equally, I think something that comes up is just at a more profound level, the visibility of transboundary waters. Is are RBOs really empowered? Are they given the power they need to advance cooperation and achieve these things? Equally, is it put on the agenda enough in national governments, or are all other institutions typically aligned to the national level, and then you've got this basin which crosses borders? Are we aligning enough to that, or is transboundary too often considered a discrete, separate thing? So these were some of the threads that I think led us to thinking about this session. This is just a kind of a starting point, but we look forward to the panel discussion to see what emerges. So just to recap some of the objectives of this session, to present and discuss a fresh assessment. So we had this speculation, but we wanted to ground it in evidence. So we had Oregon State with IUCN do a more rigorous study to really confirm a lot of our suspicions about the pace of cooperation, whether we're going to achieve it or not. So that will follow my presentation. We'll get a more rigorous assessment of that. And then we'll have a panel discussion, which centers around whether this status quo is sufficient or not, or if it's not, what are some of the key changes that can be taken forward. So in terms of the program, as I just said, just immediately after me, I think the names have changed somewhat, but in terms of the current status and assessing the pace. But in any case, the institutions are the same. We'll hear a nice presentation from Oregon State and IUCN that evaluates the pace of cooperation, tries to really more rigorously determine if it's sufficient or where we're falling short. And then we'll have a really fun panel discussion. And then James will get the tough task of pulling it together at the end, distilling some key messages and ways forward. So with that, we look forward to an exciting session. I'll pass it back to Maria to then move into the presentation from Oregon State. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think you just did the task very easy for me. So I'm just going to call up the next speakers. And I want to call up the two presentations at the same time, so the three of them can be on stage because they'll complement each other. So it's Alexandra Turgul, she's the manager of Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database of OSU, and they're doing all this data, and they're bringing this data to this conversation. And then there's Zoe Rosenblum, and she's the PhD candidate with OSU, and she's been very involved in the Shared Waters Cooperation Facility project. And then there's Diego Hara, legal officer from IUCN. So if you can please come to the stage and do your thing.
Thank you, Maria, for the introductions, and thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. We're looking forward to a really engaging session. So I'm going to set the stage and talk about some trends that we're seeing emerging from the Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database, which I manage, based at Oregon State University. And so this is really what we're seeing in practice in terms of how states are cooperating over their shared water resources. So the TFDD is a geographic information system that houses information on how the world's freshwater systems are governed and managed. We have several different data sets, as you can see on the screen here. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the treaties database because that's the one that's most up to date. But if anyone has any questions about the database in general, you're welcome to network with me afterwards, or my email will be on one of the slides at the end. So, like I said, we're updating the treaties database, and this is a repository of more than 900 agreements between countries on how they are managing and governing their shared water resources with a focus on river basins. We have many, many codes looking at things like how water is allocated, how things like uncertainties are addressed, what different dispute resolution mechanisms states have developed. Are they mentioning international water law principles in their treaties, things like that. And this is a map here that shows the spatial distribution of agreements. And based on it, you can see that there are still many, many gaps in different parts of the world where basins don't have treaties. And this is really important because, yes, while many treaties are weak, they're not robust, and they're essentially just paper tigers. Treaties are an important first step in institutionalizing cooperation and helping states come up with sustainable and resilient transboundary water cooperation. We can see that there's about a third of basins in the world that don't have an agreement in place. And based on what you can see with the map on the right, which shows the spatial distribution of agreements by country as opposed to by basin, we can also see that most treaties are not basin-wide, and they are only signed between a few states in the broader basin. Historically speaking, we can see that treaty signing peaked in the 1990s, not a surprise, coinciding with a lot of environmental protection movements more broadly that were in place at the time. And we can see that there's been a steady decline since. We can also see in this graph that different regions have sort of signed their treaties at different times. And it's really interesting to think about why this might be and how different broader geopolitical trends, the involvement of third parties, things like this might have influenced how this graph looks the way it does. What are treaties about? We've seen that treaties are becoming more diverse in their scope, and if you attended a session earlier this morning, I also mentioned this because it's really important to recognize that while earlier treaties were focusing mostly on things like navigation and water quantity, now, in the past few decades, we've really seen a broadening and expansion in what countries are cooperating over, and this is really an important step in creating more sustainable and resilient cooperation. We've seen treaties talking about things like water quality, environmental protection, agriculture, tourism, really taking a more holistic approach to basin management. It's important to take a minute to think about how agreements are institutionalized. So there's 4 main ways that this can happen. Treaties can establish an RBO. They can have a dispute resolution mechanism. They can have a provision for monitoring the treaty, the implementation of it, and they can have a mechanism for monitoring enforcement. Are the countries actually doing what they said they would do? And we can see in this graph that, unfortunately, monitoring and enforcement mechanisms are not very common. And this is a huge gap in cooperation, because how can we actually have sustainable and resilient cooperation if there's no way to actually enforce these things? And I'll talk a little bit about this later as well, but I just wanted to point it out now. So what are we seeing? Just to summarize briefly what I said earlier, about a third of the world's transboundary basins do not have an agreement in place. Treaty signing peaked in the 1990s, and we've seen a steady decline since. But the core issue areas in treaties have been shifting over time, suggesting that cooperation is becoming more holistic, more robust, and progressing more towards standards of integrated water resources management. The most common points of cooperation between countries still, however, tend to be at the technical level, centering around issues such as information exchange, joint management, technical cooperation, so setting up like joint research projects, for example, and environmental protection. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I do want to briefly point out that transboundary water allocation is a very popular topic of cooperation as well. And we don't see, however, a lot of allocation mechanisms that are flexible to hydrologic variability. And this is a very important oversight, because how can institutions be resilient to climate change if there's no way to adapt to changing climatic or hydrological conditions? And finally, we see that institutionalization mechanisms have declined in the past 3 decades, especially enforcement and compliance mechanisms, again, leaving a huge, huge gap on how can we actually assess cooperation and how is it actually being implemented or enforced if those things aren't being talked about. So that's supposed to say, where are we going? There we go. Where are we going? We have, however, seen a shift in water diplomacy to go beyond the river and to look at more things like groundwater and wetlands. Especially in the past few decades, there's been several treaties that have been signed over shared aquifers specifically, which is very exciting. New technologies present new opportunities and challenges for water cooperation. For example, satellite monitoring, citizen scientist data can provide real-time information on things like water quantity and water quality that circumvent the secrecy that some states typically handle their shared water resources. Also thinking about things like desalination and the implications that that holds for hydropolitical relations in certain basins, especially water-scarce ones, is very interesting. We are missing inclusive stakeholder participation in many parts of the world. And as I'm sure we all know, inclusive stakeholder participation is a key ingredient to sustainable water cooperation. Thinking more about this from an academic research point of view, there are also some gaps that need to be filled. For example, how can the inclusion of certain provisions in treaties make institutions more resilient to climate change? What does transboundary conflict and cooperation look like from a multi-scalar perspective? For this presentation, I've been talking about these things happening between states, but of course, subnational and transnational actors are very much involved in transboundary water conflict and cooperation as well. So it's important to approach this from a multi-scalar perspective. How can we link or assess mechanism design with the effectiveness of treaties or RBOs? What does treaty effectiveness look like or RBO effectiveness look like, and how can we measure it? And finally, we also need to think more about how climate change is going to impact both basins and the institutions that govern them. And I think, oh, sorry, I don't know how to back up.
Maybe this. All right. Thanks, Alex, for that overview. I'm just going to follow up on that and highlight a few points to raise questions of whether the pace of progress that we're seeing is sufficient. I'm just going to move so I can maybe see. I'm so short. All right. So Alex mentioned the shift to looking at water diplomacy beyond the river. So these are things, initiatives that you've heard of maybe in other sessions here or in other places, like Source to Sea. So rather than looking at water resources at the basin scale, expanding that a bit further away from just the river to also include the coastal areas. Or looking at different frameworks like rights of nature to understand just different ways of protecting ecosystems and making sure that they're getting the water allocations that they need as well. In terms of our research from the Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database, we've developed new codes, like Alex was saying, on groundwater and wetlands. And so we see from there, as she mentioned, we've seen more agreements made on aquifers, but they're still scarce. So only 20 of more than 400 aquifers identified by EGRAC are covered by international agreements. And about 11% of international freshwater agreements specifically reference wetlands. But in order to think about whether this is sufficient, we need to look at more information than just the percentage of agreements that are covering these topics, right? So one thing we can look at is how this has changed over time, which is interesting. We see the first agreement that referenced wetlands was in the 1800s, and then there were many more, like a lot more, in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. But then the question is, how are they referencing them? So this one in the 1800s, it's no surprise that it wasn't about wetland protection, right? It was about just delineating a border based on a wetland. A lot of the ones in the early 1900s and into the 1950s were more focused on deliberately draining wetlands to reclaim land for agriculture or to protect communities from flooding. And then into the later, like into the 90s and early 2000s, we're seeing treaties that cover wetlands specifically for protection of wetlands. And so looking at how those references are distributed, we see a few instances of deliberate destruction of wetlands, countries agreeing to destroy them, like I was mentioning, for reclamation, for agriculture, but actually a lot of references as well about specifically protection of wetlands. I'm going to skip this for now. The next point of if the pace of progress is sufficient is looking at inclusive stakeholder participation. So we know from the database that about 14% of international agreements mention stakeholder participation in some way. And we're including new codes now on gender mainstreaming to understand where in the world treaties are also talking about gender in some way. However, we know that we lack gender disaggregated data, so we need more attention on inclusivity and representation. So for example, if we look at how stakeholder participation has shown up in treaties over time, we see that there's much more through the 90s and 2000s, which is great, but again, we need to better understand how that's changing, who's being included, how are they being brought to the table, and whose voices are being heard. Then we have the global trends in conflict and cooperation dynamics. Conflictive events in shared waters do not appear to be subsiding, and unilateral development of infrastructure, especially, is a major driver of conflict. Given climate change and efforts to increase clean energy, there's more development of dams, especially in the global south. So given this, we need to understand how to meet our climate goals while still maintaining resilience in our basins. And there are many factors that impact whether cooperation or conflict happens, and many factors that influence these events. So there are also a lot of changes in global biophysical conditions, like climate change and natural disasters. Alex was mentioning the allocation of water resources in freshwater treaties and how it's not very flexible. And so when we have less predictable water flows, we need to have treaties that are flexible to adapt to those different conditions and help countries understand how to change the water management in those instances. And this rapid pace of external change requires new or different agreements. There's, from research from Aaron Wolf and others, we know that the likelihood and intensity of a dispute rises as the rate of change within a basin exceeds the institutional capacity to absorb that change. And so with this, we want to look at institutionalization of treaties and agreements. And we know that the area of waters covered over by agreements has only expanded marginally in the last years. Fewer than 50 agreements have been signed in the last decade. And this is constrained often by financial limits. And so especially when there are financial constraints in a basin, a treaty that was formed in the past might not receive the funds and institutionalized cooperation that it needs to continue. This can also limit the breadth of data exchange. Also, factors like trust might limit this. And then there's also this issue of fragmentation. So institutions lack coordination often across sectors. Sometimes the governance of water resources, so the ministries that come together to form agreements over fresh water are from different sectors. So like the Ministry of Agriculture sometimes manages fresh water, or sometimes it's the Ministry of Natural Resources. And these have different aims. And so that can also lead to different outcomes for how the waters are managed and across scales. And so with that, I want to hand over to Diego to continue this discussion on institutions.
Many thanks, Zoe. And with this information, I would like to ask a couple of questions. The first one is, then if we see that there are only 100 transboundary river basins that lack agreements or treaties, what happens in these basins? Is there chaos there? And also, does this mean that in the other 200 basins that have an agreement, everything is ideal, all stakeholders are working together, the institutional work from river basin organization is ideal? These are some questions that we have that we need to think. In my view, and this is something that we at IUCN, in the work that we do in water diplomacy, and mainly with Alejandro Isa, who is the heads actually of the brains behind the work on water diplomacy, we always think, is treaty, is it an institution, the final goal of water cooperation or of water diplomacy? This is a question for you as well. In my view, in our view, and even as from a legal perspective, I think that the processes that are ongoing at different levels are more important than treaties and institutions themselves. Of course, the treaties, they serve as a vehicle in order to coordinate actions, in order to implement specific activities, but this doesn't mean that treaties are the final goal. And for this, in the work that we have at IUCN, we have been working in basins with absolutely no treaties, where there is no coordination between ministries, where there is no activity even at the technical level. And then the question is, what do you do here? What do you do in this type of basins? And of course, just to mention here what I put in the slides, treaties and river basin organizations, of course, they facilitate water cooperation and anchor water diplomacy, but this cannot guarantee effective management and governance of transboundary waters. And I think it's important that we look at these numbers, but that we can also take into account that having a treaty, having a river basin organization is not the end on itself of this work on water diplomacy. But then, why are treaties and river basin organizations still missing? And some of the colleagues already mentioned this, and in some of the sessions in the morning we saw there are complex and conflicting interests. We see, let's say, for exchange of data and information, several countries say, well, we cannot exchange this data because of our security, because of national interest. What do we do in this type of cases? The same in the lack of political will. There are basins where an agreement is needed, but the political will of heads of state, of ministries, is not there. In the same way, inadequate legal and institutional framework, we saw already that it is not only important to have a river basin organization, but also the institutions at the national, subnational, and local level. They have to be strong, solid, and they have to address all of these aspects that were mentioned in the first section of this presentation. Also, data and information gaps. If we do not understand, if we do not have monitoring systems adequate in order to understand the conditions of a river, the conditions of a lake, how can we know, how can we ensure effective actions, effective management of these rivers? And of course, something that we have been mentioning during the course of this day in different presentations of sessions, financial capacities. Many countries, unfortunately, due to financial constraints, they have not been able to establish any mechanisms of cooperation. And then what can be done in the absence of treaties and RBOs? The approach that IUCN has had over decades has been to mobilize water diplomacy. And how does water diplomacy look like? It doesn't look only from the perspective of heads of state, formal meetings, big river basin organizations, but actually from the people who are the ones affected, who are the ones that live, that depend on the ecosystems of specific rivers, specific lakes. And with this, I would like to mention that these people, these different stakeholders, these different non-state actors, they are the ones that need to need to help drafting new agreements. And these new agreements or new approaches, new vehicles for water cooperation should take into account the new complexities that we face in the current world. Looking at geographic scope, for instance, we know that the focus of treaties, transboundary water agreements, started just looking at specific rivers, then progressively at the river basins, but now we see that we are talking about, thank you, Maria, that we have global systems. With climate change, something that is global change can affect many whole regions. So the scope of the work that we have to do in transboundary water cooperation doesn't need to look only at the river basin, but also at the regional level, and also at the global challenges that can affect the management of a basin. Also complexities, actors, different mechanisms, and dispute resolution mechanisms. In the sense of scope and complexities, we already saw from the data on the first type of agreements that were developed on transboundary rivers. They focus first on navigation, and here I put a picture of the Amazon River. Of course, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, the first treaties between Ecuador and Peru, Colombia and Brazil, and others, they were mainly focusing on navigation. But now, due to climate change, this is a picture from the Amazon River from last year, where you see drought in the Amazon River. Navigation is not possible anymore. So countries nowadays, they have to negotiate new agreements to address drought. This is what we refer to as complexities. And of course, the pace in which states, ministries, they see this type of challenges is not fast enough in order to have agreements, in order to draft agreements. So this is why we have to think about new approaches to water diplomacy. Then, of course, normative and institutional mechanisms. We are focusing, or we have seen mainly treaties, formal treaties, but there are also other types of mechanisms for managing, for regulating transboundary waters, and some of them can come from the initiative of local communities, from the initiative and inputs of academia, NGOs, organizations such as IUCN, and these have helped to have standards, guidelines. Here I mentioned some of them. For instance, in terms of hydropower, being hydropower one of the main drivers of change or of impact in transboundary waters. There have been many types of efforts to regulate this type of activities. We know about the work of the World Bank and IUCN in 2000 with the report on dams and development. Nowadays, there are new standards and guidelines to show that in the absence of action, in the absence of a formal treaty, other organizations need to act. And also rethinking water cooperation. Complex scenarios such as plastic pollution, mining, climate change, droughts and flood also calls for action from different stakeholders. In these pictures, I'm including some indigenous communities where in the absence of actions from ministries and head of states, and they, in order to protect human rights, access to water, ensuring the protection of rivers, they have gone to regional courts of justice. They have taken even cases to the constitutional courts at the national level to improve the management of rivers and lakes. This to show you that there are new and different approaches that we need to take into account for water cooperation. And of course, what we mentioned already, the different levels that water agreements need to look at, from global to local, going to regional, national, subnational, and in many areas, not looking only at international water law, but other important aspects, human rights, indigenous people's law, investment. If you see the work that hydropower companies are doing in transboundary rivers, the role of international investment law, and also to connect this with the topic of this World Water Week of peace, the importance of having international humanitarian law also considered in treaties. these agreements can be binding and non-binding. With this, I will finish. Thank you very much, Maria. Just remember that multiple needs, interests, and priorities in transboundary waters require dialogue and cooperation. Thanks.
Diego, you can stay on the stage if Zoe and Alexandra would also join. We're going to go to the panel debate very soon, but first we wanted to check if there was any questions regarding what has been presented. Then the panelists will be obviously talking about their own experiences with the pace of transboundary cooperation. But before that, we just wanted to check if there's any questions in the room, and we'll do the rounds. Okay, I see 1, 2.
Thanks very much. Diego, you mentioned that there's a need to look outside of the actual treaties themselves. And I guess the question for the database itself is, are there legal agreements or documents in the database that aren't necessarily river-focused agreements? Are they, regional economic documents that mention water? Do they offer stakeholder engagement? I'm curious if that's already part of the database, or maybe if there are future plans. Thanks.
Should I answer? Okay. Sure, that's a really good question. The short answer is, well, there's not really a short answer, but so we do include documents that aren't legally binding, like memorandums of understandings, declarations, things like this, but all of our documents are focused specifically on water management, and if water is not a primary focus of the agreement, water as a consumable resource that is, then they're not included in the database. However, we are always looking for ways to expand the scope of our database, and I think your suggestions for including things like, you said economic documents and things like that, that might include water within their scope would be a really important way to increase the scope of our data sets, but currently, no, not really.
Okay, thank you for the very interesting presentations. I wanted to, the title of this whole session, to draw attention to that. So in the 1/3, you said 1/3 of the river basins, existing river basins, have some sort of treaty. That's one aspect, but are these treaties being implemented? Or is there, so is there, because, there's also lots of national water policies. Every country has multiple, but the problem is they're not always implemented. And so has there been any, have you looked at that as well?
Question. So the implementation question is really important, and that's one of the messages I was trying to convey when I was talking about how many agreements aren't institutionalized in that they don't have monitoring or compliance mechanisms, and there's no way to enforce the treaties actually being implemented. So the short answer, yeah, it's a problem, but I do also want to note that treaties, as Diego was saying, they're not the only ways that cooperation happens, especially when we look at what's happening at more local levels in transboundary basins. There are still more informal forms of cooperation, but at that international level, there's still many gaps in the monitoring of the implementation of agreements.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that. We are starting to look also at the implementation or the functioning of river basin organizations as an example. And it's a bit hard to say when a river basin organization has ended. They're very infrequently formally ended. And so we end up with kind of zombie river basin organizations, as Susanna Schmeier calls them. Because on paper they exist, but it's hard to tell when their last actions were, and it's difficult for researchers to say, okay, this one's gone.
Thank you. Perhaps one reflection from my side is that indeed there are these agreements that can be called zombie agreements when the commitments that were in these treaties, they are not fulfilled by states. And in the same way by river basin organizations. And I can mention a couple of examples from our own work at IUCN. where we have been asked on how to strengthen river basin organization, what to do with them. And this is a very complex exercise because river basin organizations depend on the mandate of states. And their effectiveness depends on the mandate, the financial capacities, technical capacities that they can have from the states as well. And in this sense, one reflection that we had was that having a river basin organization, be it good or bad, like you can think that is perhaps not working, is always helpful because there is already something established, something that can bring stakeholders, that can bring countries to take some action. But indeed, in this kind of scenarios, rethinking, renegotiating an agreement, strengthening a river basin organization should be the path. Thanks.
All right, thinking about next steps on where you can take this study or maybe others, qualifying the kind of outcomes that happen if the RBO has these things or if it doesn't have these aspects. So if it does have the monitoring mechanism and or has the enforcement mechanism, then these outcomes have been observed. If it does not, then these kind of downward spiraling outcomes have been observed, but at least these things happen. I think that would be useful in convincing others to either evolve their existing RBOs or establishing new ones.
Thank you. I'll let you answer, and we'll take one more question before we go to the panel.
I'm not sure if there is anything online, perhaps, Maria.
Oh, no, that's fine. Okay. I'm keeping track. You don't want to...
Sure. I'll address what we...
Yes, please.
Just a brief response. That's a really good point, and I think we're going to start addressing that with our update to the RBO database, which is going to become a joint basin institution database, one to sort of broaden the scope of organizations that are included in the database. And a few of the things that we're really looking at now that weren't rigorously looked at before are things like implementation of the RBO and like what kind of monitoring mechanism specifically, because just because something has a mechanism for monitoring, it's not necessarily going to be a good one, right? But that's also a challenge, like what does good monitoring look like, or what does an effective RBO look like? And those are ongoing questions that researchers and practitioners are both wrestling with as we're trying to increase our understanding of what good transboundary water cooperation is.
And specifically looking at what the outcomes are is research that we want to do if we find more funding to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Al-Qadi, and I'm from Technical University of Munich. I have a question related to these treaties. I'm always wondering if there is any index that evaluate the existing treaties, perhaps based on factors like cooperation. But when we're talking about cooperation, we're talking about like if there is like a data sharing hub or conflicts that where we learn from our previous mistakes to not implement it in the new treaties, or even to improve the treaties and basins in the basins that we work on. Is there any similar index that we can evaluate the treaties, because they are limited, and I believe that it's possible that we can evaluate them, right?
Perhaps we can wait a little bit for one of our panelists is actually going to mention specific words. There are global database that can show some experiences, some best practices, and can respond to your question. We will have that during our panel. But I wanted to know if we can collect a couple of questions more. And also
I think that's we're good. There's just one question online, but I think we sort of looked at it already. But they're just looking at if there's a kind of international monitoring system for the valuation of the final output of treaties.
Very good.
So that's
also that links to what we are going to see in the panel. Actually, that would be
okay. So there'll be an answer to that in the panel debate. Yeah. I want to thank our presenters. And I'll invite the moderator of this panel session to come up to the stage, Natasha Karmi from the Geneva Water Hub. She'll be the one introducing the panelists and running the show until the end. Thank you.
3:20. Maria, 3:20, and then we have till 3:20. Okay. So, yeah. Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Rose, for actually this fresh assessment. I, for one, have really a clearer picture of how far transboundary water cooperation is on the road, at least to meeting SDG 6.52. I would like to call the panelists on board. So please, Marissa, Luna, where are they? And yeah, please come on board. As a water community, I think that we definitely do have a lot of milestones to celebrate. But we also have the knowledge, the experience, and the tools to address the challenges and the opportunities that have been, clearly visible in this fresh assessment. And I think we are on the road to one finish line among many. And especially when we think about it within the context of this year's theme for the Stockholm Water Week, which is actually the bridging of, water for a more peaceful and sustainable future. So I'd really like, on behalf of myself and the Geneva Water Hub, to thank the organizers, IUCN, Oregon State University, EMI, and the State Department, for not only organizing this session, but also for putting forward this important and intriguing question of fit for principle, but is it insufficient for purpose? So to kick off this panel discussion with our experts, I would like to start off the last slide that Diego had showed. And as my title suggests, I'm biased actually to Water for Peace. So, and I find that in transboundary, as a transboundary water community, we often tend to overlook that the dialogue and the cooperation that we saw in the middle of this slide is only a bridging between the multiple needs, the interests, and the priorities, but that our end objective and our purpose is actually to ensure the future sustainable conditions that you've put in the slide for people, for nature, for development, and for peace. And while we were having these discussions, with our panelists and with their organizers, I'm sure that most of you have come across the fact sheet by the Pacific Water Institute, and with that disturbing, trend on water in armed conflicts. So I therefore encourage our panelists, but also all of you in the room, to challenge us on both what is insufficient based on your experience, but also on what is the overall purpose of the transboundary water cooperation. We're challenged by climate change, but we're also being challenged by non-water related conflicts. So I'll pick up on what Julian said, and you said basically that, we have a lot of multi-scaled and political dynamics that can frustrate transboundary water cooperation. So I would like to frame this panel discussion and flip the coin and say, instead of thinking of it as in terms of frustrating, let's see how water can actually get us, to have more peaceful communities. So let's refresh, let's rethink, and let us hear from our panelists. So we've heard a lot of ideas. We've heard from Diego about new approaches in water diplomacy. So as a first round, let us hear from you. What do you think about what you've heard based on your experience and basically what you are doing currently? So let's start off with you, Luna.
Okay, thank you very much. And I was asked also to be specific on the Ganges River Basin. So my answer will be more, about the Ganges and the experiences there. And so, as most of you probably know, transboundary cooperation in the Ganges has been very disappointing so far. There's no formal RBO that has been set up. The countries, the riparian countries, don't really trust each other. But flipping the coin, that doesn't mean that this course can be changed. And so there are three things that I think could help change this political will. One of them, has Diego mentioned as well, is to include this broader thinking on participation and water discussions. So far it's been very top down, the transboundary talks at top level, but broadening the participation, including like the lower levels. There has been some very good signs, for example, in this disaster reduction area, where communities, cross-boundary communities, have been working together and developing early warning systems. So basically that's one. The second one is really changing this outdated mentality on data sharing. So as many of you might know, in the Ganges, not all, but certain riparian countries have this policy of data secrecy. And not sharing data, of course, it hinders assessments. And especially now with the impact of climate change, it's even more important to have this open data for future planning, right? And then it also creates this environment of mistrust. And so changing this data sharing policy, but I've been working in this area since over 20 years, and it hasn't opened up yet, but maybe it will. And then the third is in the Ganges, a more strategic approach to link as well as de-link water issues from broader political questions. And so, for example, the talks between Nepal and India, it quickly goes in the direction of Nepal wanting to maintain its sovereignty. And then it becomes very emotionally charged, and then the talks just stop. And so in this sense, de-link it from this broader political issue. So maybe I will stop here to give the other panelists also a chance. Yeah.
Thank you, Luna. And maybe later on we can also hear about the data centers.
Oh yeah, that's the second question.
Yeah, it's fine. Marissa.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on what was presented earlier by our colleagues?
I wanted to add that something that I've seen here in this session, I've heard in this and others, and in my own experience as a communication specialist, is that I see that sometimes we don't have an identity as a basin. We don't have a common identity, and you cannot take care of something if you don't feel part of a whole system. And this is related also to convince people to be aware and to value the resources that we share. And in this will lead us to have a cooperation instead of start thinking on mandatory or enforcement. So I think a way through is to build a common identity among all the states, all the riparian states.
Thank you. So again, going from the top down, so always focusing on the idea of all stakeholders being part of the process.
Yes.
Michael, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My reflections will be anchored also on the Nile Basin where I work. Transboundary cooperation in the Nile Basin has taken a number of different forms over the years. From the earliest, but the modern form really starts in the 1960s as a response to flooding and disasters, where countries came together to try and understand what is this causing these problems. So they set up a monitoring system that was jointly conceived and implemented to collect more data, and they also carry out specific assessments. And this, of course, led to countries believing that even more institutionalized cooperation can be the way to go. So in the 1990s, they started discussing how can we move this forward. Countries decided on a two-track process. One of them was to negotiate a treaty, an agreement that really binds them together. Many of you have heard of it, the Cooperative Framework Agreement, which has caused quite some challenges in the basin. But countries felt that waiting for the negotiation of the treaty might not also be very useful, because they needed benefits that immediately. They needed they felt that by already implementing some cooperative efforts, they can also demonstrate why the treaty is very important. So they set in place a transition arrangement, which is a Nile Basin Initiative, where I work, as a way of already benefiting from these mechanisms even before the treaty comes into place. So NBI is about 25 years now. It has been doing a lot of work in the areas of confidence building, trust, dialogue, but also data and knowledge generation, capacity building, and investments. And I think this is what has led to countries believing really in cooperation as the way forward. And as a result of that, recently, countries have completed actually the ratification of the Cooperative Framework Agreement. And this is a very exciting time when countries are starting to discuss the establishment of the Commission. It's exciting for a number of reasons. Of course, this is something countries have been waiting for long, but even from the presentation, it was clear. There are new challenges that are going to come up or are already manifesting themselves, and they have to be addressed, including issues around maintaining participation of all member states. When it was a transitional mechanism, Nile Basin Initiative, non-binding, countries have been very willing to fully participate, but as it moves towards a more formalized cooperation mechanism, there's some splits about in the cooperation that need to be addressed, and countries are willing to do that. But the other thing is that countries have big problems to deal with in terms of poverty, in terms of low economic development. Countries look at investment in transboundary projects as a very major way that they want to benefit. Actually, all the investment countries are doing in terms of transboundary cooperation is towards improving the condition of their populations. So investment becomes a very important aspect. Resource mobilization for investments is very important. Nile Basin Initiative has prepared a lot of investments, but some of these, just a few have reached the point of implementation because of resource limitations, and it causes frustration among the member states when they don't see the benefit coming out faster than they thought. But issues of climate change, issues of groundwater, issues of ecosystems and wetlands are really becoming very, very important within the basin, but also issues around optimizing actions to avoid duplications, because countries have set out also other mechanisms within the region. Lake Victoria Basin Commission deals with Lake Victoria, which is a sub-basin of the overall Nile, but there are also others that are dealing with similar things. And only now, really, we are coming together as the different organizations to discuss how we can align our efforts rather than keeping on duplicating and competing and trying to bring down each other. So there's a lot of excitement about the future in terms of the completion of the treaty and the Commission, but there's also challenges that countries have to deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for also sharing how, the scope within the Nile Basin Initiative was adaptive, and how there was this flexibility, and how these new elements are being thought through as they move to a more binding agreement. Yeah. Norris, what is your take on what was presented?
Thank you very much. From the presentations, it is clear that we really need these institutional frameworks in the form of treaties and RBOs. Today, there is much excitement and interest on the establishment of this tri-basin institution called BOPUSA. It's not my first time to be invited to speak about it. There are a lot of invitations where I have presented on this very interesting institution. But the question is, yes, the institution is now there to run these three basins, the Buzi, the Pungwe, and the Save watercourses that are shared by Zimbabwe and Mozambique. But how sustainable is this arrangement? We are from 2001, when engagements kick-started. All the processes have been funded externally. We have the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, IUC and GWP, and various organizations who have come on board to fund this whole process for a period of more than 20 years. But if they chicken out today, will we be having any Bupusa Commission to talk about? Because even after its establishment in 2023, the agreement is clear that member states should contribute towards the functioning of this institution. But it's now the second year, and no resources have come from the member states, which is a bit worrying. That should the project, assuming the GW project currently running now, which is ending in December, what if they say, no, we are done? So really the issue is on sustainability. And you know, these RBOs and these transboundary issues, they come with the heavy resource needs. The e-flows that have been done for Pungwe so far, the comprehensive e-flows, they cost 500,000. For Buzi, we are told they would need 600,000 and 1 million for survey. If these member states are unable to make 100,000 contributions per year, what about these other issues where we need really real money? So the issue of sustainability is so worrying, especially in Southern Africa. Then number two, there's an issue of resilience of these RBOs in the face of global dynamics like climate change. Right now, Southern Africa is ravaged with the El Nino-induced drought. At the same time, it's dependent on agriculture. Rainfall is seasonal. So what if one day Zimbabwe will say, from the 43 planned measures that we have, we are now building dams for our citizens so that we'll do our agriculture through irrigation because there is no reliable water to talk about. So this is another challenge where we may see unilateralism because these governments have obligations to their citizens. So in face of climate change, we may be having serious challenges in as far as these RBOs are concerned. And lastly, there's an interesting issue that was brought as we visited the Pungwe a month ago. We met an old man who said, no, we've been seeing you driving this vehicle, you know, it has got a label, Bupusa Commission, what. But what is this Bupusa thing? What is the benefit of us, the communities? We have not seen anything tangible. We as people who live in these water basins. So are our RBOs and these treaties resilient to issues that are coming up now, emerging issues like community participation? Are we involving our communities, or is just a top-down approach that is being taken? I think for now, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for raising the issue of the financing, because I think also in the study that you've conducted, there was the issue of, are we financing just the water cooperation as a mechanism, and then when it is time to actually finance water cooperation, the funds are dry. And I think, you know, It's quite surprising, you know, what they have to go through now, that the funding, that the agreement has come to light, that there isn't enough financing for the actual implementation. Thank you for sharing that. Joanna, welcome online.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. It's unfortunate that you weren't able to be with us today as planned. However, thanks for being online. And we'd like to also hear from you about the results that came out of the assessment and the suggestions for new approaches in water diplomacy. So please, we're all ears.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Maybe let me take off maybe from what Norris has just presented now, and what is just said around the sustainability and the financing, and really the real benefits of transboundary cooperation, especially at the local level. And for me, it always starts from, or at least from the work that we do, it always starts from cooperation for whom? Transboundary water cooperation from whom and for what? Yeah. So, and very much looking at it in terms of issues around, you know, in whose interest are we cooperating? And especially where cooperation is donor financed or externally financed. The questions around sustainability are inevitable. And the issues around interest and common interest specifically, and what motivates that cooperation become key in terms of how we sustain. And so when we're looking at it, even when we're coming back to the question of fit for purpose, whose purpose, you know? So what is the motivation around cooperation? And especially, I think, looking at it in terms of what has been presented, it is very clear that cooperation takes time. So some things, I think, within the timeframes, even if we had to look at it in terms of the SDGs, 15 years, it looks like a long time, you know, out to 2030, but it's very little time when you think about it, that for some to just get to a cooperative agreement in whatever form, it takes more than 20 years. But I think the important thing that we see, and it is clear, is that countries will cooperate. And these interactions, you know, between the countries, you know, it's up and down depending on what are the issues, but they will cooperate. I think Southern Africa is a good example of that, to say that for, you know, even though there is this, you know, the shared watercourse, you know, I mean, the SADC protocol, the revised protocol of 2000, that provides a framework for transboundary cooperation. It has provided the basis for which countries have come together. So it might not be in the form of RBOs or what we might want as specifically it, you know, but there is cooperation and it takes time. And sometimes I think like what Michael has spoken about, you have to demonstrate the benefits of cooperation before it can actually be institutionalized. You know, so it is important, I think, when we rethink or when we look at it in terms of transboundary cooperation, and I think the presenters preceding this panel discussion have spoken to it. But for me, I think it becomes important to say, how do we support the establishment of shared watercourse institutions, for example, and be it, you know, arriving at an agreement, or even the formation of commissions or basin organizations, whatever the form. So it's more looking at it from the demand side. I.e., you know, what do the riparian countries want, and versus what projects, externally funded projects, require. So we do have, I think we do have set definitions of what we mean by transboundary cooperation, especially when we're talking about it in terms of external support. But really, if we are going to talk about sustainability of transboundary cooperation, what do the countries require, and what is that form, and what is the structure that will enable sustainability, not only in terms of the organization that comes out of it, but also in terms of the cooperation that comes of it. So if we're looking at it in terms of that, in terms of that being a foundational kind of thinking around transboundary cooperation, then maybe we can say, you know, if we're looking at, you know, reinvigorating or revitalizing transboundary cooperation, it has to always come from in whose interest, because at the end of the day, you know, at least from the AMCAL perspective, you know, we're guided by the aspiration that actualizes the Africa Water Vision to say, How do we have in Africa where there's an equitable and sustainable use and management of water resources for poverty alleviation? That's the first thing. Socioeconomic development, regional integration, and cooperation, and vitality, or at least maintaining sustainable ecosystems. So for me, I think this is important. But at the end of the day, I think we have to look at it to say in whose interest. And if we are going to say transboundary water cooperation, for whom? Is it managing transboundary watercourses for their own sake, or is it for us to try and make sure that we manage the resource in such a way that it enables, development? And what does that mean? So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for also bringing in that lens of the different, definitions and ownerships of what transboundary water cooperation means within different, geographical contexts. I think that's also something that we have to bring into that, refresh approach to water diplomacy. Let me ask you very specific questions that are related, specifically to your work. And I think, we'll probably have to answer in 1 minute each so that we give time to James to conclude. So Luna, going back to, your center hosts 3 global data sets. So, and we saw, that in the study, it said that the breadth of data exchange was problematic. It was an issue. So in your experience, how important is data, information, and the new technology when we are thinking about the future of transboundary water cooperation?
Yeah, so of course, the new technology offer a lot of solutions. For example, the SWAT mission, I think a couple of years ago, it can now calculate discharge of rivers, 100-meter wide or wider. However, still, all these remote sensing products still need measured, observed data for ground truthing. And unfortunately, globally, a lot of investment the investment in remote sensing technology, of course, is going up. There's like satellites, I don't know how many there are now all over, but the investment in situ monitoring is going down. And that is really worrying because, and this was also mentioned as a game changer in the meeting last year in New York, that just because we have a lot of new technology and remote sensing products doesn't mean that we can now stop measuring in situ data. And so I think, that has to continue, and it has to, we had a session this morning on glaciers. So if you go above 2,000, 2,500 meters in the Himalayas, it's hard to find any climate stations and so there's that. And one more thing, citizen science was mentioned also a couple of times earlier, and it does open up, another format or another way of collecting data. However, it's still quite separate. So you've got the formal data, with fair data principles, and then the citizen science data, but they're not always brought in together and institutionalized together. And so that's also a problem, and we could, work on that a bit in the future as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Marissa, you're a co-founder of the Women Water in the LAC region. And we've talked about stakeholders and including those, the new codes on gender. So what do you think that the contribution of women and their perspectives, how would that play out in the joint governance, for example, of transboundary waters in the Rio Grande?
Well, I'm going to read so I can stick more to the time. Yeah.
1 minute. I'm sorry to rush you, but we're running out of time.
Well, the prevalence of few women in the water domain has been studied in the fields of engineering, irrigation, and diplomacy as a male-dominated fields with high influence in transboundary governance. Women are gaining access to positions of greater power, but they are not necessarily guarantee the incorporation of the gender perspective in decisions internally and externally. They already talk about the need to collect data and disaggregate it by sex. In Monterrey, we had a problem. We had an example of a situation that affects women when they are maintaining water allocation to uses that affect the availability for domestic use. And this we saw this in 2022. In the case of Chihuahua, in 2021, farmers opposed with violence to the water deliveries to the U.S., but no matter how much support and benefits they receive, this and the access to decision-making in that sector are practically null for women. They say it is their water, but Texans farmers could claim the same. The transformation of irrigation culture can be benefited from traditional knowledge as well as from proposals on science and technology developed by women. Two of the projects that competed in the Youth Water Prize in Mexico this year had to do with the incorporation of technology for water reuse with impact in agriculture. We also have remarkable researchers in groundwater. We developed an educational guide in Rio Bravo, in the Mexican part, from the River Basin Council, and it showed us the interest of students, teachers, civil organizations, researchers, users, and companies, not only in improving knowledge, but also in generating initiatives from the community. Why? Because we need and we want to focus on positive social participation and not violent, as we saw in Chihuahua. Yet our councils have institutional challenges, as we've discussed, about to finish. We see opportunities on women's highest positions in strategic organizations in the region, the Transboundary Water Commission, the Ministry of the Interior in the U.S. is an indigenous woman, the Ministry of Environment in Mexico, our new Mexican president is a scientist, and of course the possible president of the U.S. as well. There is a huge opportunity here to create more spaces and capacity building for them and for more excluded women.
I have
finally,
to stop you. Thank you. I really have to stop you. I'm sorry. I don't like to do it, but Michael, any last words about how the RBOs or the regional initiatives can speed up progress in terms of this new way of thinking or bringing in these new elements of water diplomacy?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll keep it very short. Now, one of the challenges that transboundary organizations face is really around enhancing the spirit of ownership by the member states of that organization, because it also affects issues related to sustainability, financial. So if transboundary organizations concentrate on I already mentioned benefits, but also ensuring that they are moving at the same pace as the responsible institutions within the countries that they are working for, because I believe that transboundary organizations are much better off if they concentrate and specialize in coordinating efforts of others rather than being the all-in-one implementers. So that issue of making sure that countries buy in, countries own, and countries are able to deploy their resources also result in much larger benefits than if we look at it from one angle. The issues that we deal with keep on growing, and I'll leave it at that. They keep on changing, and we also have to be very dynamic to make sure that we change to keep up with the times. Thank you.
Thank you. Norris, you have actually participated in negotiations and in crafting water agreements, including the recent ones. And so can you share with us, like very briefly, key elements that have enabled the dialogue actually between Mozambique and Zimbabwe? What comes up to your mind when you think about key elements of this process?
Yeah, thank you. For dialogue to kickstart, there should be triggers. And in this case, what triggered dialogue were natural causes. It was a series of droughts in the 1990s. And the droughts no political boundary. So the two riparians were forced to negotiate because they had no option. So that was number one. Number two, a legal framework assists in these engagements. So this dialogue started in 1996, and 4 years later we have the revised protocol on shared watercourses for Southern Africa. it played a very big role. And also the two countries had to come up with a joint water commission agreement to create a framework on how and when they can engage each other. Also, they had to do joint mechanisms to make sure when it comes to these transboundary issues, they will do these issues together. And also, Zimbabwe and Mozambique shares a history. There is political will from the highest level. That is why even when this institution was signed, the agreement was signed, the two heads of states had to witness the signing of this. But also coming to how these agreements inform negotiations, number one, there's the issue of trust, which is a process. Trust is built over time. So as the parents were negotiating, trust was built. And when trust was built, compromises were made along the way.
Can you just cite them? Can you just give us the key elements, please? I'm sorry.
Okay.
So trust?
Yes. You also have to compromise. And also the contentious issues have to be paid if they are to delay negotiations. And also stagger your negotiation. Start with less complicated issues moving to more complicated issues. So yeah, these are the
Thank you.
ones.
Trust, compromise, delay issues that you can't agree on. Thank you. Joanna, any last words from AMCAO and on these new approaches of water diplomacy? Is this something that is being discussed within the council? Have you, tried to look into new modalities? Briefly, again, I mean.
Yes, no, briefly. So I think it's clear in terms of the discussions here that sustainability of transboundary cooperation will only, be there if we're able to demonstrate the benefits of water to other sectors. So for us, I think what is critical, and especially as we go towards the development of the post-2025 Africa Water Vision and policy, we're looking at how do we then make a business case for water to other sectors and therefore unlock national investments and financing to enable, transformative change. So already at AMCA, we have a program that is financed by several donors, including the USAID, for example, and national governments themselves, that strengthens governance systems and mechanisms to revitalize investment-oriented transboundary water management. But key to it is looking at the value water principles and the promise that they hold in terms of unlocking investments within the water sector, and especially demonstrating and making a business case for water to other sectors, and therefore ensuring that within national governments we have the necessary investments for water before we start to look outside for what can others bring. So sustainability in transboundary water management will very much rest on that in terms of how we demonstrate the benefits of transboundary cooperation to the countries, and especially in terms of how it can deliver transformative change. So we're looking at transforming livelihoods and sustainable economic growth on the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for all our panelists for sharing your reflections and experiences. And James, floor is yours. I know we've taken some of your time, but I think it was important to have these reflections from our panelists.
No, I'm sure people would rather listen to the panelists than they would listen to me. So thanks very much. My name is James Alton. I'm the Global Director of Water and Wetlands at IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Thank you very much for sticking with us through this event. I don't have time to summarize in the way that I was planning to because I have too many points to pick up on. But I want to thank the panelists very much for their insights into these tricky issues, and also very much to the researchers, to Diego, Alexandra, and Zoe, who put the effort in on finding out some of the answers to these questions. When we first came up with the idea of this session, which also I must shout out to my colleague Sarah Chera Davison in Pretoria, who's been behind supporting Mozambique and Zimbabwe with the Buze Pungwe Save, the Pupusa agreement, and also to Julian from the State Department, because we had these discussions about, are we moving at the right pace, and are these instruments and treaties and formalized processes that take years Are they going to get us there in the pace of change that we need to be able to cope with climate change, competition and climate impacts on water resources? And I think the research shows that clearly not. We've flipped the question around to say there are some great successes and amazing things going on, but the challenges are becoming much harder and much faster hitting the institutions and the architecture that we've created for transboundary cooperation. And therefore the opportunity is for us to double down really and put more effort in, but also look at different tools and tactics to get us to cooperation. And rather than just purely the formal approaches, but to look at actually how we can look at informal approaches and a multitude of different arrangements that will get us to that. I'm being warned of by the organisers, so I won't say much more than that. I have a whole load of points, but what we will do is we'll put something up online. Please do reach out to the panellists if you want to grab them before we leave the room so that you get to talk to them further and ask them further questions. We're also hoping to take this research further, to put that into a document with some further findings. And I think the question on what does implementation look like, for us actually it's a really important point. A lot of the time countries come to us saying, we've got agreement, but we can't implement it. We've got an agreement, but we don't have the resources. We don't have the capacities, but we're ready to go. So how do we make that happen in practice? So I think that's a really important point, is the opportunity right now there is to accelerate and to really make cooperation a stronger reality in this world of complexity that we face and these increasing climate and competition issues around water resources. So with that, I thank you all for being here. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to Joanna online, and have a good rest of your water week. Thank you.